at our fall study day and to take some time to consider and discuss and explore the important themes raised in Tim Carney's book, Alienated America, Why Some Places Thrive While Others Collapse. Our annual fall study day is an opportunity for the Catholic bishops of Minnesota, the staff of the Minnesota Catholic Conference, and our policy advisory committees to gather together to think and consider what are the challenges facing us as a community today, how can we speak to those effectively with truth and love and bring the gospel voice and our principles into the public square. Often we take this discussion up internally, but sometimes we open it up to others when we think we have a particularly compelling speaker or set of panelists, and that we'd also be very much enriched by the participation of the people in the pew, but also other members of our community who aren't Catholics. So we're grateful for Catholics and non-Catholics alike for your presence today. Following the event, our bishops, our staff, and our advisory committees will gather again for further discussion about this morning's program, and again to consider what issues and things that can be explored and addressed at the intersection of ministry and public policy. In a moment, I'm going to invite Archbishop Bernard Hebda to the stage to offer a brief word of welcome and thanks and a prayer before we begin. But I wanted to say a little bit about Tim Carney's book and why we invited him. Really speaking to a timely topic. We see the political polarization around us, alienation, the challenges of community, the political churn and polarization, anxiety about the future. What is going on out there? What are the challenges? I don't think I'm giving away anything by saying that Tim's ultimate recommendation is that we need to do better at loving our neighbor. Certainly, this is not always a satisfying answer to those of us in the policy world, but it's actually the harder and more difficult thing to do. As Dorothy Day said, love in theory sounds nice and wonderful, but love in action is a harsh and dreadful thing. And indeed, loving our neighbor is a challenge, and we often want to just look at policy solutions. Policy solutions, though, are important, and they are a component of loving our neighbor. As Pope Francis says, politics is one of the highest forms of charity because it serves the common good. So public policy and considering how we build stronger communities is a component of loving our neighbor. But public policy is necessary, but not always sufficient. We're glad to have Tim Carney, really an experienced journalist out of Washington, D.C., and someone who really spent a lot of time traveling America, meeting people in what Pope Francis might call the politics of encounter. When we are able to go out and actually talk to each other, get out of our bubbles, the natural spaces and places in which we run, and get out and talk to other people and hear their perspectives. One columnist said in a word of important wisdom, it was Ross Douthat actually of the New York Times, but then it was retweeted by President Obama, that somewhere out there, someone on a different side of an issue than you has a perspective that you need to hear. And then it's in that spirit that we invited Tim Carney today to talk about some of the challenges facing us, but then also put together a really distinguished panel of respondents who represent all kinds of sectors of public life and society to bring their reflections and their perspectives on these challenges and these issues. And again, I'll introduce them later, but we have representatives on our panel today from academia, social services, the clergy, the federal government, and a social entrepreneur focused on community resiliency. I look forward to inviting them to the stage and introducing them following Mr. Carney's keynote. With that, I'm going to pause before I get into some of the logistics for the day and invite Archbishop Bernard Hebda to the stage. Archbishop Hebda is the Archbishop of St. Paul in Minneapolis. This is his third episcopal assignment, having served previously in Gaylord, Michigan, and is coadjutor Archbishop of Newark. He is always a brilliant, kind, and humble man, despite having an undergraduate degree from Harvard and a law degree from Columbia. He wears his learning very well and is a gracious leader and a delight to work for and to serve with. So I'd like to invite to the stage Archbishop Bernard Hebda.
Thank you, Jason. I didn't recognize that person you were describing. How wonderful to have so many of you gathered here today as you participate in this study day. As Jason said, I can't hold a job, so this is the third diocese I've been in. And so I've worked in Catholic conferences in 3 different states, and I grew up in Pennsylvania, so that's really a fourth experience. And I don't know of another Catholic conference that recognizes that bishops need to learn. And so this is a wonderful opportunity for us as bishops, and to have all of you to be part of this, to learn about what is going on in our country among our flock. I was flying back from Florida yesterday, go figure, huh? And obviously everybody's trying to get out, and all of the TV screens were flashing pictures, videos from the Bahamas, a little bit on the intensely discouraging side. I was coming down the aisle on the plane, and somebody says, "Preacher, give us a message of hope." And I realized that ultimately all of us who are men and women of faith are purveyors of hope, a real lasting hope. But for us to be able to proclaim hope with credibility, we need to know something about the world in which we live. We need to know certainly what Christ has done for all of us. We have St. Paul tells us that it is in hope that we are saved, and that was the title of a great encyclical by Pope Benedict, Spe Salvi. And so we recognize how important is hope. And yet so often we have that sense that we're living in a society where there's a great dearth of hope, where there are so many who are alienated. And so for us to be able, as men and women of faith, to be able to proclaim the gospel, to proclaim that hope, we need to know something about the society in which we live. I'm so grateful, in spite of the introduction that was off the charts from Jason. I have great respect for him and the way in which he's able to pull together resources, both locally and nationally, that help us to delve further into an issue. I'm really grateful to Jason and to his staff at the Minnesota Catholic Conference for giving us such a great day. I'm delighted that there are so many of you who are here to participate in this with us, to help us to learn, and really to go deep in trying to understand what are those things, those longings that are in hearts that need to be addressed, so that we might be able to restore the fabric of civil society. Let's begin with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. Loving God, we thank you for the gift of this day, for this opportunity that you've given to us to love you and to serve you, and indeed to be proclaimers of the hope that is sourced in you and in your Son. Yet we dare to ask for more. We ask that you would be with us this day, that you would open our hearts and ears to all that you desire us to learn. We would ask that you would send your Spirit upon our speakers to help them to proclaim those words that are so crucial for our understanding, so that we might be able to be that salve in society that you desire, that we might be able to help people to open their hearts and their minds to the hope that is rooted in your Son, Jesus Christ, and that together we might be able to build that kingdom that you desire, that kingdom where peace and justice shall reign and shall meet. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen.
Thank you, Archbishop Hebda, for clarifying that one of the main purpose, the why behind today, is to learn how we can love our neighbor better, and that's a purpose of going deep into some of these great topics. One of the things that we need to do better in society is to complain less about our public officials and encourage them and thank them. And I'm delighted that two of my favorite legislators are here today. And I'm not just saying that to brown nose, they really are. Representative Jerry Hertas from Greenfield is with us, and Representative John Kosnick from Lakeville are with us today. Two men of just really great character, principle, and wonderful to work with at the Capitol. So thank you very much for being here. We should give them a word of thanks for their service. I'm delighted to introduce Tim Carney, who I've just gotten to know over the past 24 hours. We have many mutual friends, but just been delighted by our conversation and the fellowship. For almost 20 years, he's been a columnist, author, and editor in Washington, D.C., and he's currently commentary editor of the Washington Examiner and a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. His writing has appeared all over. I'm not going to give full bios of our speakers. We have copies of the bios on the tables, and you can read the full intro, but for the sake of time, I'm going to keep them abbreviated. His first book, The Big Ripoff, won the Templeton Enterprise Award in 2008 from the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and he's written a lot about crony capitalism, among other things. He is a native of New York, an Irish Catholic family, and he lives in the Washington, D.C. area with his wife and their 6 children. God bless him. He's here today missing his kid's first day of school, so we're very grateful for Tim's service and time with us this morning. Tim Carney.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to speak to an august crowd. I've never had to figure out what the plural of Your Excellency is. Is it Your Excellencies? Is that the way you speak? This is not something I was taught, but anyway, thank you very much. And we talk of hope, but Peter Kreeft, great Catholic writer, once said, you can't really get the good news until you get the bad news, and so that's my job here, is to bring some of the bad news. I'm going to tell a story about the American dream, largely about the perception that the dream is dead. And so I'm a political journalist, and so my story, naturally enough, begins in the state of Iowa. And I am an Irish Catholic, and so my story begins in a bar. It will get to the church later. It ends there. But it was a place called Joe's Place in Iowa City, and it was shortly before the Iowa caucuses, and I met this couple that worked at the university. And she told me she was from Orange City, Iowa. And I'd been all over it. I'd never been to Orange City. I was interested. But again, as an Irish Catholic who's interested in, ethnicity and history, the color orange can occasionally be a little triggering to us. So I said, what exactly does the orange mean? And she said, well, it's Dutch. And I grew up in New York. You were either Italian or Irish. And again, ethnicity interests me. So I said, exactly how Dutch is Orange City, Iowa? And this woman, whose name was Holly Van something, said, let me put it this way. I used to march in my wooden clogs past Windmill Square on our annual Tulip Festival. And I thought she was putting me on. It sounded like a Simpsons episode of Dutch people in the Midwest. And again, where I come from, you were Irish or Italian. I kind of knew there were Germans in these kind of places, but these large concentrations of Dutch people was a mystery to me. So I went out to Orange City, to Sioux County, Iowa, the Dutchest county in the United States of America. And I found a lot of things, including learning about Dutch history. The politics out there was interesting, and I promise I'm going to keep politics discussion to a minimum. But notably, Sioux County ended up being, it's a very Republican place, but in the Republican caucuses, it ended up being Donald Trump's single worst county. And so, conservative place, uninterested in him. So it jumped out at me as something very interesting. What was going on there? Well, one thing you found, if you look at the sociological data, among rural counties, Sioux County has basically the lowest overdose rate. It has the lowest high school dropout rate. It has the lowest rate of men who have dropped out of the labor force. All these bad outcomes, out of wedlock birth, if you look, you can find a high correlation between Dutch population and these good outcomes across Iowa. And so this started to really intrigue me. And I asked this one guy, he was the husband of a professor. I said, what is it about Sioux County that makes it different from a lot of the rest of rural Iowa? And he said, well, out here, people vote right but live left. And I didn't know what live left meant. I thought there was something like kind of crazy going out there, because I'm a conservative guy. But he said, no, you take care of your neighbors. You look after the poor, and I didn't like his description of it as live left. I didn't think it needed to have a political label at all. He was describing high social trust and a very strong sense of duty to the poor. Something that we would wish would be in every corner of America, but was particularly strong there. And so I've been out since to Holland, Michigan, and saw a lot of the same things, and very tight-knit communities. And I was wondering what was going on with this. Like, is there something in the Dutch blood that led to this going on? So I went out to Oostburg, Wisconsin, and I saw the root cause of a lot of this high social trust and good sociological outcomes. And what became obvious to me then should have been totally obvious before. I sat at the counter in Judy's Diner in Oostburg, Wisconsin, and all the families came pouring in from the 9:15 service at the Christian Reformed Church, and then from the 9:30 at the First Reformed Church of America, and then from the 10 o'clock service at the Bethel Orthodox Reformed. There were 4 different Reformed churches in this village of 2,000 people. And the other things, and again, all the good outcomes. One of the complaints was from an auto mechanic out there. He said, I showed up at the public school where I send my kids for the Christmas concert. There were no seats. All these people who send their kids to local Christian schools were taking up the seats for the concert. I said, Jim, you don't even send your kids here. Why are you taking up my seat? And Jim said, we had to come watch our kids. So again, not their own children. The children of Oostburg are our kids, which is evocatively the title of one of the books by Robert Putnam. He wrote Bowling Alone. He's since written Our Kids, about that idea. Again, high sense of duty to one's neighbor in these places. And the root is not the Dutch blood. It's these very strong churches. That Dutch Reformed churches went across Middle America and planted not just churches, but these tightly knit communities. If you go to Oostburg, there's a charity there called Our Home Christian Ministries, a family called the Riedicks. Their son, they moved to Oostburg because they found intense amount of support and sympathy and help for their son, Mike, who has cerebral palsy. And then they decided, if this place has this much love and will help us with our disabled son, we can turn that into love for other people with disabilities. So developmentally disabled adults, somebody donated the Riedicks a house, gave them a house when they moved out to a smaller apartment, an older couple. So they turned that house, they built a little apartment off the back, and they turned it into a home for developmentally disabled adults. And the little apartment houses staff. They've since built up, through donations and other things, 4 homes in this village of 2,000 for developmentally disabled adults. You will find, if you go to Holland, Michigan, if you go to any of these little towns that I talk about, Oostburg, Orange City, you will find these grassroots charities that sprung up out of an intense belief that, yes, we are going to love our neighbor, and people actually living it. And if any of you have ever been to Salt Lake City, you see the welfare system that the Mormon church runs out there. It's just absolutely incredible. And I know, and when my visit out there was very eye-opening as well. And if you look at people trying to study the happiest places, often it's, one magazine judged Orange City the happiest place to raise a family in America, and others that look at bigger cities will name Salt Lake City. Not to say there aren't problems in these places, but certainly you have very high levels of trust and very high sense of duty to one's neighbor being carried out. But it's not just these sort of religious, tightly knit, and frankly fairly homogenous communities that are turning out these good outcomes. Where I live in Silver Spring, Maryland, well, first of all, in Silver Spring, you do have exactly that. You have 2 Orthodox synagogues, more modern Orthodox synagogues. One, they just go by the name of the street they're on. One is on Arcola Avenue in Silver Spring. One is on Kent Mill Road. Those neighborhoods, because of they're not allowed, they have to be able to walk to church, right? There's a prohibition on driving on the Sabbath. So the neighborhoods around those 2 synagogues, incredibly tightly knit. And so it's interesting having 6 children and not being Jewish in Silver Spring. My wife walks into a grocery store there, and they immediately direct her to the kosher food aisle out there. But also near me in Montgomery County, Maryland, is Chevy Chase, Maryland. And so I use that as one of the first scenes in my book, Alienated America. Chevy Chase is the wealthiest municipality, the village of Chevy Chase. This is not like lesser Chevy Chase. Brett Kavanaugh came from a different Chevy Chase, which is not quite as hoity-toity, because the village of Chevy Chase is the wealthiest municipality in the wealthiest region, in the wealthiest country in the history of the world. And something I had to tell a lot of my conservative Catholic friends was that these wealthy, left-leaning people are not a bunch of swinger pot smokers, right? That they are practicing what we, conservative Catholics are preaching. They're finishing school, getting married, finishing school, getting a job, getting married, having kids, all in that order, staying involved in their kids' life and in their communities. And if you look at elite communities around the country, places where majority of the adults have college degrees, you see the same good outcomes that I was describing in more middle-class places, like around Utah, around the Dutch places in the Midwest. You see those same good outcomes. So you have two different types of places, right, that where people are less, teenagers are less likely to get pregnant, kids are less likely to drop out of high school, drug addiction is at a much lower rate than it is in the rest of the country. Not that these problems are absent, but they're much less prevalent. Two different types of places. These elite, highly educated places, and these intensely, closely knit religious places. The thesis of my book, my argument, and I firmly believe this, is that they're not two different types of places. What makes these the same kind of place is the web of institutions of civil society, things that people can belong to, whether it be the public schools in where I'm from, Westchester County, New York. They're not just these factories, they're schools. You belong to the public school. You feel you can shape it. Whether it be the church that the people belong to, where it's not just people checking in on Sunday for an hour and then checking out, but they really belong. This is where they spend their free time. This is where even if they don't send their kids there, it's an institution that they belong to. Whether it be the little leagues, the country clubs, the alumni networks, the professional networks, the charities, the bowling leagues, etc. All of those things that people belong to, that is the key. That is the path to the good outcomes. So when we talk about, what makes a strong community or something, I think the key place to look is at those institutions. What do you belong to? How many people, and this was a lot of what Robert Putnam measured in Bowling Alone, he found it dropping across the board in the United States, but it was mostly dropping among the working class. So it is a little more alienated to live almost anywhere in America, I think, than it was 20, 30 years ago. But that sense of alienation is primarily a working class phenomenon. And I'll put it another way. America has secularized a lot in the last 2 generations. That secularization is a lot less harmful to people who can join a country club, a little league, a strong public school, a professional network. To the working class, church was civil society. And when secularization hits there, it's deadly. And so what does civil society do for us? Sometimes people in this room probably are very intensely tied into lots of things you belong to, and you can take it for granted. And so you have to take a step back. The safety net is one. So I begin the book with the story of my daughter Eve. She's now the only one home with my wife. By the way, my wife's name is Katie. All of you who pray for my wife who has 6 kids for 2 days without me, and I'm traveling a lot this fall, so pray for Katie. But right now she has only one. She's potty training Eve. She's 2.5. But when Eve was 1, she had to go to the hospital, this horrible breathing condition, and had to be kept on incredibly powerful oxygen that was only available at Children's Hospital, 40-minute drive away. We got so much food brought to us at our house and in the hospital for that 1 week that we were like giving it away to other neighbors. My son said, do you know that was the best lunch we had at school my whole life was that 1 week? Because it wasn't me making the lunch. It was somebody had brought a thing from Corner Bakery. And when I was describing to the nurse all the stuff we had been brought, I said, oh, that came from somebody in my wife's book club. That came from somebody who belongs to the same pool. That was a couple at our parish. That was a family at our boys' school. And all these people I just thought of as friends, I found the grammar I was using, there was always a hub. There was an institution, the pool, the school, the parish, etc., that was connecting us. And anybody who, if you had a baby and people were bringing you food, if you're bringing people food, all of that is usually connected through an institution. So that safety net, that human-level safety net, is a necessary part of anything, especially raising kids, right? And people don't have that as much if they're not plugged into institutions. Also a sense of purpose. We are obligated as Christians to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, house the homeless, all of that. I know a couple people who do that sort of thing. When we were in our 20s, I would find out that they woke up on a Saturday morning, made a bunch of sandwiches, and went down to the metro station and handed it out. And these are amazing people. But for most of us, if we do corporal works of mercy, we almost always do it by plugging into an institution that is built that has built systems for us to go and visit the imprisoned and feed the hungry and do all that sort of stuff. So that sense of purpose, that ability to do the good work that we are obligated to do, that also has positive psychological and sociological benefits on the doer, institutions are what do it. For me, I think one of the main plagues, if you look at opioid epidemic and that sort of thing, is a sense of purposelessness. A guy might have a job, but it's hit or miss, and he might feel like if he disappeared, nobody would miss him. Maybe he has children, and there's a large number of fathers out there who the mothers don't want them in their children's life. They feel they're actually better off without without the father around. We all have difficulties in our lives. One of my difficulties is not feeling that I have nothing to do or no purpose. I have the opposite problem. I see somebody giving me a look after Mass trying to hunt me down, and I'm like sprinting to the car because I can tell from that look that they're going to ask me to do something else. Once after Mass, I couldn't get away. This guy said, "Hey, Tim, I see Meg is signed up for the basketball team." I said, "Yeah." He says, "Well, we don't have a coach yet." Okay. Meg was in kindergarten, so kindergarten basketball should not exist. And I was saying last night that the only reason it does, the reason my wife signed Meg up was because she was like, oh, imagine how cute it would be for her and Kateri to be running around, and they don't need a coach to look cute. They already look cute. Let them just run around, okay? I said, and this is 2 years ago, I said, look, any other year I would do it, but this year I'm extra busy, and oh no, is there something going on with your family? I said, no, I'm writing a book. What's the book about? It's about the importance of community yeah. So I am undefeated as a kindergarten girls basketball coach. Went 4-0 that year. Meg never quite was able to reach the hoop with her shots. But so that sense of purpose, we get that from belonging to things. But there's more. And I look at a lot of sociological data in the book, but just mobility is one of them. There's an economist named Raj Chetty who saw that a lot of people say, oh, there's not as much economic mobility in America as much. Yeah, it's kind of about as even. But it's even with what it's been in past decades. But it's very uneven geographically, which is to say there are some places, Salt Lake City is one example, where wherever you're born, you have a good chance of doing better than your parents economically, education-wise. You have a good chance of climbing up relatively. And there are a lot of places where that's not, in fact, the case. And so what was the difference among these places? So this guy's an economist, so he did multivariate regression analyses where you're controlling for everything. Some things like a better student-teacher ratio had a small positive effect on mobility, but not a big one. The two things that had the biggest effect, number one, percentage of intact families, percentage of children raised by two married parents in a neighborhood. So the child being raised by two married parents didn't have as much of an impact as much as them living in a place where most of the children were raised by two married parents. And I think this is very related, various measures of social capital. So how much volunteering was there? How many organizations are there? How many people belong to things? How many people give to charity? Those were the two best predictors of a child's ability to do better income-wise or education-wise than his parents. And again, the family thing is connected. A wise woman once said, it takes a village to raise a child. And some of us didn't like what we thought were the political implications of that. But if you're a parent, you know how much it takes support to raise children. And so the retreat from marriage in the United States is mostly a working class phenomenon. There are college-educated men and women who are getting married later than a generation before. That's a delay in marriage. It leads to smaller families. I don't think that all of that is great, but that's not the problem here. The problem is the people who never get married or get married and get divorced. That's a working class phenomenon. Women without a high school degree, without a college degree, used to, if you look at, are you married at age 40? So taking out the delay in marriage for the most part. There used to be no difference in based on educational attainment. College degree, some college, no college, all about 80% of women at age 40 were married. Now, a drop-off in all three educational cohorts, it's fallen from 80 to 65 among college-educated women. It's fallen from 80 to below 50 among women who have only a high school degree. The retreat from marriage is a working class phenomenon, and I argue that that is largely, probably mostly, because working class people are less likely to live in the sort of communities that support the rearing of family. And so what else happens when you have a lack of civil society? In writing the book, I went to a place in PA called Uniontown, Pennsylvania. I picked Fayette County. My daughter's, this is not kindergarten, this was like 6th grade basketball assistant coach was from there, grew up there. But I picked Fayette County because I found a grad student who had done a study on the drop-off in church attendance or adherence in counties in the U.S., and among evangelicals and Catholics, Fayette County had a massive drop-off. You know, they've closed a dozen, I think, Catholic parishes in the county. The Methodist Church in Fayette City just shut down. And so I went to a bar called Smitty's just outside. Smitty's is the type of place I used to avoid as a political journalist because everyone would just answer, "Oh, politics is BS. I'm not voting." You know, you can't see in from the driveway, which is all gravel. It's kind of intimidating to walk in. You feel like the music stops when you do walk in. But if you sit long enough and ask people questions that are not directly about politics, they start talking about politics, so you can get something out of it. Also, Smitty's has the best wings in southwestern Pennsylvania, which might be why I ended up there. But I was talking to these guys, and they were talking about the economy, and this weird paradox where they say there's no jobs, and then almost 2 sentences later, every time, they'll say, and nobody wants to do the jobs that are there. And so they'll talk about this laziness epidemic, which I don't know how grounded in data or fact it is, but then they'll start talking about who's on food stamps and who's using food stamps to buy stuff for their dog and who's on disability and could be working, and the laziness, and this conversation's going on at 2:30 on a Tuesday afternoon. And yes, I was there at 2:30 on Tuesday afternoon, but it was literally my job to be there. And so I asked one guy, Dave, I said, "Dave, why don't you work?" He was 50, and he says, "Well, I've got this bad back, all these back surgeries." I said, "So most of the jobs around Uniontown are manual labor. You can't, there's not desk jobs." There are desk jobs, but I can't sit still for more than half an hour without excruciating pain in my back. And I said, "Dave, you've been sitting at that bar stool for an hour and a half." But he looked at me, he said, "Well, today I'm numb because my son died this morning." The numbers I had known about Uniontown had just been numbers until I was staring Dave in the face and saw the pain. He had stopped drinking 2 years before and fell off the wagon that day. And also the explanations of what's wrong with these places. Oh, well, after the factory shut down, the men just weren't willing to change their ways and get their act together. Or, oh, no, they're not really suffering out there. It's just, privileged white men upset that they're losing their privilege. All those explanations struck me as total lies at that point. There was real suffering, real pain in these places. And I would argue a lot of it is that the economic explanation is incomplete. A lot of it is the collapse of the institutions of civil society. A bartender at Smitty's on another visit is expecting her second kid, and she told me, on a Friday night, if you want to do a family thing, great. What are you going to do in Uniontown? When we were kids, there were go-kart tracks. In Fayette City, a small city, dying city, it's not even a city, I call it a former town, there used to be a swimming pool there. And the guy working at the newsstand in Fayette City said, yeah, that's what we did constantly, every day in the summer. The swimming pool is filled in, is now literally a junkyard. There's not stuff to do. I went up to a street called Millview Street in Uniontown, and you stand there, and Uniontown is very hilly. And I was thinking about this, my daughter's basketball coach describing growing up there, and you can see from some of these front porches, like 50 different front and backyards. And you can just imagine all the kids running around, and they're playing stickball, and they're shouting 3 blocks over to their friend, and they're riding their bikes down the hill. There was none of that going on. It was dead on Millview Avenue, except one front porch. There were a handful of people. It was after lunch, and they said they were just, recovering from the day before. One guy had a black eye, and I was asking them about their time there. Bizarrely, one guy who was on parole had to go back to where he was supposed to be in Sarasota, Florida. So he was sneaking out of Sarasota, Florida to come to Uniontown. So there was some draw there, but it was not activities or things they belonged to. The guy who I think owned the house or lived there, Jason, I said, what do you do? Like, he's like, well, last night we were partying. Today we're hanging out here. We're eating. He makes money in some way that he wouldn't specify to me. But I said, Jason, like, do you belong to anything? And I said, do you go to any church? He said, my church is a Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Jason, which is to say, himself. And I said, what do you belong to? He said, I belong to myself. And he thought it was weird at that point. He sort of, at that point, I'd been on the front porch for 20 minutes, made it clear I wasn't welcome anymore. These people belong to themselves. And that's alienation, and that leads to these deadly outcomes. So what else does it give us? One thing is it gives us our current politics. And again, without wanting to get too deep into specific politics, just saying, man is a political animal, right? We're supposed to not just mind our own business, but to shape the world around us. Our duty to love our neighbor and Aristotle's insight that we're a political animal are largely the same message. We're supposed to shape the world around us and help other people. How do I shape the world around me? I coach sports teams. You can actually see the world, my part of the world looks different from a satellite picture today because of my ability to plug into an institution, which is to say the baseball field had totally overgrown, and I started a T-ball program and youth baseball programs that took things I never could have done on my own, but because I belonged to a parish, they were like, okay, they got the guy who's the groundskeeper at Catholic University who does their baseball fields to volunteer his labor to remake our infield. This is the sort of thing that can't happen unless you have people able to plug into an institution and do it. So I shape the world around me through participation in local politics, mostly through belonging to a parish and a swim club and an office place. Things are different because of my efforts, and that's probably true for almost everybody in this room. But if you don't belong to these things, you're still a political animal. That instinct is still there. And so you think, I've got to change it on the federal level. And so when I camped out at Occupy Wall Street in 2011, I was struck that I've written on crony capitalism. I thought I'd find a bunch of occupiers who were really upset about the bailout or the way that the Volcker rule was being implemented without teeth and all these policy wonking things. Nobody talked about any of that. They all said, well, we're being kept out of politics. I said, by what? They said, well, by the big banks. So what do you want to do? Well, we want to take back power. Okay, so let's say you kick those guys out of the smoke-filled room and you take power. What are you going to do? We're going to make sure that the government listens to the people. Okay, what are the people saying? Like, they never got to the there. I thought it reflected a shallowness, but it didn't. It reflected that basic human desire to have a say in the world. And this is a Bernie Sanders campaign. If you paid attention 4 years ago, it wasn't largely Medicare for all, et cetera, et cetera. It was empowering people, restoring the idea of democracy. Now, again, I mostly exercise my power in these institutions I belong to. When fewer people belong to those institutions, it heightens the stakes of national politics, of debates, and that sort of thing. So I'll talk about causes, and as far as solutions, I'm going to be very light on it because we've got 4 people right there who are much better at this than I am. I'm the bad news. Hopefully they're going to help bring in the good news. So what's causing the collapse of civil society, mostly among the working class? There's lots of it. I sort of used Alexis de Tocqueville frame of saying there's over-centralization and hyper-individualism, which while they sound like 2 different things are really 2 sides of the same coin. One thing is over-centralization is a crowding out by government. There's a study I cite in the book that politically connected lawmakers, like the members of the Appropriations Committee, the ones who brought more money into their districts, saw a greater drop-off in church charitable spending than the others. And so that suggests, doesn't prove, but suggests that government crowding out is a real thing. Also, over-centralization economically. When a Walmart comes in and everybody from 3 towns is driving to the Walmart, then fewer people in each of those towns is walking down the street of their main street and the serendipitous encounters with neighbors. So those are 2 different things that I think are over-centralization that eroded. Hyper-individualism as well. We've got our phones, our 900 channels, everything can just be in our own house and we don't have to rely on anybody else for anything. Also, I argue that the sexual revolution is an instance of hyper-individualism, destroying community, that marriage is increasingly thought of as a bilateral contract where both people are benefiting, as if it were a business arrangement, rather than the way I see it and the church understands it. It's in front of a community. It's not that you get married and then you go have a party with your friends. The marriage ceremony or mass is with the community. It's an inherently, and it's a permanent thing as well. And that idea of belonging to something not in a transactional way, but in a deeply relational way is I think that's unpopular today in a hyper-individualist society. And very specifically, this is where I'll get the most political, the federal and many state governments are trying to drive the church out of the public square. I mean the church broadly here, the Catholic Church, Protestant churches, Jewish and Muslim churches. That there's an effort to say, how much Catholic organizations have had to retract from doing adoptions. The state will say, you are not allowed to do adoptions unless you do it according to our morality. And I understand. I understand being in a minority when it comes to teachings on marriage and sexuality, but that we can't operate these institutions of civil society, these charitable things, we can't do these works unless we follow their rules, is largely saying we can't do these works. And I think the schools are going to be next. There's going to be an effort to drive religion out of the public square. And they'll say, we're not anti-religion. Nancy Pelosi was defending the suit against the Little Sisters of the Poor, and she said, she was getting flustered with all these questions, and she said, look, I do my religion on Sundays, and then she said, and other days that I go to Mass, and she might go to daily Mass more than I do, so great, so I'm not going to say she's a bad Catholic of any stretch, but you can't do your religion on Sundays if your religion is a real heartfelt Christianity. If you listen to the words of Jesus, you have to do your religion all the time. You have to love your neighbor all the time. And so we are actually being denied our free exercise of religion if the state or federal government is trying to say anybody who holds on to traditional teachings of marriage, any hospital needs to perform abortions or we're going to drive you out of business, all of these are not just, they're actually infringing on our free exercise of our religion because our exercise of our religion includes these corporal works of mercy. And in the book, I focus mostly on exterior causes of the erosion of civil society. I wish I'd focus more on the interior causes, the way in which organizations themselves have caused their own weakness. And it's pretty easy to guess where to start when your main organization is a Catholic Church. So I came into the church as an adult in 2004. So my confirmation in Washington, D.C. was by Cardinal McCarrick. My parish in Maryland was founded by a priest who was later credibly accused of sexual abuse. The first pastor on Capitol Hill at St. Joseph's, when I started attending Mass right out of college, was removed from active ministry after credible accusations, multiple credible accusations of sexual abuse. Some of the accusations had come in before he was made the pastor there, and I didn't know, none of the parishioners knew. the social trust I was talking about, the trust, has eroded so much. I was at my local pub, the Stained Glass Pub, with my book. I wrote some of my book at the bar, and when you're writing a book at a bar, well, you sound like a million other people, right? So I held up the book to show it. And one guy saw there was a church on the front. He said, yeah, I used to go to church. And he was a Catholic. And so I tried to be an evangelizer here. And we went back and forth, and then he said, look, I wanted to take the parish kids on sort of a hunting trip. I wasn't allowed to because I hadn't gone through all the background check type stuff. They treated me like I was a criminal. And then he found out later that the pastor who was doing this, that pastor got removed after credible accusations of sexual assault. So a criminal was treating him like a criminal rather than a community. My spirit to evangelize died. There was literally nothing I could say at that point with any credibility to persuade this guy to come back to the church. So the total mishandling of that scandal has driven people away from the church. And then that creates a second set of victims, because people who don't belong to anything will have worse outcomes. And for me, somebody said, given the history of the people around you, the priests and bishops around you, how have you not been tempted to fall away? And I thought about it. I said, you know what? I encounter the church at my parish, at that Little League field, at that Mass, at that altar, with the phone calls from my pastor, I'm now becoming a backup Sunday school teacher. This is how I encounter the church. And this is how almost all faithful, regular Catholics encounter the church. But once you start falling away a little, then your vision of the church is what appears on CNN. And that, I have full trust in my parish. Most of us in Washington have had trouble having full trust in the hierarchy. So that, the second set of victims here are the people who are driven away from the church. So these, what do we do about it? Finding the solutions. Well, we start by getting our own house in order, and that's been talked about endlessly. I won't talk about it too much here, but on the parish level, I just want to provide a little bit of my own experience. I got asked by a parish priest, how do you think the parish needs to adapt? And I thought, okay, so if we're an institution of civil society, in addition to being, being the body of Christ, in addition to our spiritual needs, we are an institution of civil society. So let's look for the needs of the people who go and could go that aren't being met. And he said, so what do you guys need? Middle class, suburban, mostly families. What do you need? I said, we need a place to bring our children and ignore them while we hang out with other adults and the children run around safe. And the parish grounds provides exactly that. That's why I started T-ball. That's why there's going to be grilling during the soccer practice. We're saying, what are the actual human needs? Those corporal works of mercy, basically. You might not think of it if you're giving middle-class parents just a way to eat burgers, not have to cook dinner, and ignore their kids, but that's what it is. That's a work of mercy. If you're a parent, you know that. And providing those to bring people in the door, and then you give them a worldly sense of purpose, and then you give them a supernatural sense of purpose and feeling of love. But I would say parishes should think of themselves, how do we become something, not a place not where people go, but a place that people belong to? That would be the main thing that I would want to see parishes doing. There's lots of other suggestions I have in the book, like the 10 Commandments. A lot of them are thou shalt nots. We have to stop driving the church out of the public square. We have to make sure that our aid programs, our welfare programs are doing as little crowding out as possible, et cetera. Communities need to be built to be more walkable, et cetera. And a lot of it, though, is going to be on the very local level. So we talk about policy, but the people in this room, if you're involved in a parish, if you're involved in, or could be involved in something, That's what's going to make the difference. That's going to be the solution. It's not going to be some big piece of legislation on a state, federal, or even a county level. It's going to be everybody in this room doing more to connect to their neighbors and connect their neighbors to other people. When Pope Francis first wrote about the poor, I was struck by the language he used. He said the inclusion of the poor in society. So it wasn't just we have to give them food. We obviously do. If they are hungry, they need food. But they need to be included, to love our neighbor. So that's the next challenge. I'm blessed with a parish that's very diverse racially and socioeconomically, but the fact is most parishes are pretty homogenous. But I wonder if there's a neighborhood next door on the other side of the tracks where you can that involves lots of people who need to be included. And what the Mormons do is a lot of it is people who are not Mormon at all. I'm sure there's a proselytizing element to this, but you get fed when you show up at their potluck no matter what, no matter who you are or what you believe, and they want you to come. They want to include the hungry people. So that's sort of the guiding light. I'll leave you with without getting into the nitty-gritty. What can we do to love our neighbors and include the poor? It's going to involve these little platoons, these institutions of civil society. And when that happens, that's where the hope is, that we have a great awakening. It's mostly going to be institutions of civil society. And again, for the working class and the middle class, the core institution of civil society has always been the church. That's what we need to come back, and that's when we'll see a turnaround, and the American dream will once again seem alive. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim, for that excellent presentation. Tim's book, Alienated America, is part of a sort of growing genre of challenging books looking at the difficulties faced by alienation, socioeconomic exclusion, and other factors in our public life. I'd mentioned J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy, which is going to be made into a movie. J.D. Vance just came into the church a week ago, so praise God for that. That's a great book if you haven't read it, but also a very fine book by Chris Arnott called Dignity, Life in Back Row America. If you haven't seen that book, really worth checking out as well. On our podcast, a little plug for the Bridge Builder podcast of the Minnesota Catholic Conference at our website, we did an interview with Chris Arnott about his book that I'd encourage you to check out as well to expand the discussion around these issues. I'd like now to invite our distinguished panelists to the stage. We're really delighted to have them. I think we'll begin first with Dean Bloomberg. Do you mind going first?
Not at all.
Yeah. So Dean Laura Bloomberg is the Dean of the Humphrey School of Public Policy and Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota. She's been the Dean since 2017. And prior to her appointment, she was Associate Dean at the Humphrey School as well. She's received many awards for teaching and outstanding service as a faculty member. She's an expert in public policy and policy research focused, and I'm going to highlight this, on cross-agency leadership and collaboration. Maybe the Department of Human Services should give you a call. In addition, she's really built the international reputation of the Humphrey School, not only globally, but also bringing in students from around the world to learn and engage with each other at the Humphrey School. And importantly, she's also a native of St. Cloud, Minnesota. She's a graduate of St. Cloud State, Cornell University, and her PhD is in educational policy and administration from the University of Minnesota. Glad to welcome Dean Laura Bloomberg. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much for that introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here with you today, and I'm grateful to Jason for asking me to be a part of this. I'm also grateful to Jason for agreeing to serve on our Humphrey School Advisory Council. As I think about your comments, Tim, about driving the church out of the public square, I resonate with some of those comments, and it's for that reason that I'm so grateful that you're a part of our advisory council, an advisory board that's just invaluable to me as a dean. So I am a product of St. Cloud, Minnesota, and a Catholic childhood, and I am a graduate of Cathedral High School in St. Cloud. And I was thinking a lot about that as I was listening to your comments today. Tim, which I thought were just beautiful. And so I hadn't planned to share this, but I want to tell you something just quickly, and I'm hoping that somebody will give me a shepherd's hook if I will try to watch my time. But so I graduated from Cathedral High School, and without going into details, I can tell you that I honestly believe if it weren't for the nuns in that school who both showed me what grace was and also showed me what accountability was, I'm certain I wouldn't be a dean today, and I might not be alive. I was one of those kids who were making colossally bad decisions, and we won't say any more about that. But I was telling somebody recently about a particular nun that had a huge impact on my life. There was a time when I thought I hated her, often when I'd failed a test. But I think she had such a huge impact on my life, and somebody said, well, why? And I said, well, because she was awesome. She was a great teacher. And they said, well, what was it about her? And they really pushed me to distill it. And I thought, this was a nun in my life who balanced accountability with justice and this unbelievably gracious ability to give second and third and fourth chances, even as she kicked my butt. And when you talk about this notion of engagement and belonging, she did something. She was my French teacher. How many people are from St. Cloud around here? Many? Maybe you'll know this name. She lived to be, I swear, 105 or something. She's no longer living. Sister Michaela. She taught French at Cathedral High School. And Cathedral High School is situated along a main drag to St. Cloud Hospital. And I remember time after time being in French class, and if an ambulance went by with the siren on, we stopped class, we all stood, and we prayed for the people in that ambulance. And I don't remember much about French, but I sure as heck can do au nom du Père et du Fils et du Saint-Esprit, because I've done it so many times. And we would do it during a test, we would do it during conjugation of French verbs, and she would always say, French is very important, but nothing is more important than our prayers for the poor souls in that ambulance right now. And I don't know what I think about praying all the time in French class, but I do know what she taught me about my agency and my role and my value in caring about other people, and it shapes to this day how I think about my role in public life. So I thought a lot about that. There's another part of this book which I really recommend you read. It's remarkable, and it's all dog-eared, and I've got places where I disagree with you and I want to argue with you, but mostly I agree with all of your major premises. But there's something that Tim has done in this book that just resonates with me. He invokes the book of Jeremiah often and talks about seeking the shalom of the city, the well-being of the city, seeking these things that make us whole. And that certainly was all about the comments he made just now. I think about that in my role as the Dean of a School of Public Affairs, where our mission is to advance the common good in a diverse and changing world, and I'm challenged by it. We are not a religiously based organization, although I would argue that we more often than not, bring our faith tradition into the work and the decisions we make, but we're also an evidence-based school with a lot of research. And I'm encouraged when I think about some of the things that are identified in this book as fundamental to the well-being of a community and what we're finding in an evidence-based, research-based environment about the truth of it, like the value of parks and green space in community areas. And so I'm really excited that part of our programs are looking at creating a cost-benefits case for creating more green space in our poorest communities because there is a financial benefit. Now, that would not be the argument you would make from a religious or a faith-based perspective, but it's kind of nice to pair that with an economic argument that works with legislatures and municipalities as well. And that's exciting to me. We're also looking at the cost-benefit analysis of a two-generational approach to addressing poverty. That's something that we can do in our public institutions. It's something that we can think about as we think about food stamps or MFIP. And in a faith-based way, we know that family is the core of what we're talking about. It's the way you end your book, that ultimately what our institutions do and our sense of belongingness is to allow us to find this path towards family and children and fulfillment in that way. When we marry those two things and realize that we can address poverty in all of our public, private, nonprofit, secular, non-secular institutions in a multi-generational way, I believe we see the alignment of public policy and faith-based traditions. I think that, and Tim said it in his comments today, that as you told the story of your daughter in the hospital, again in the book, my husband was reading this book out loud when we were driving. We were taking turns reading it, and I had to pull over at that part because it's just so moving to think about your daughter in that situation. But you talked about the examples of people who brought you food, and when you told them, it was an institution at the hub of that. It was my book club, it was my kids' school, it was my parish. And I think that that's a really very important thing for us to keep in mind. And when we think about what I see in civil society, in the public sector, in the private sector, and in the faith community as an erosion of our trust and our faith in institutions, I think it's a clarion call for all of us to think very carefully about what we must do. And this is just one line in the book that I've dog-eared because it's saying what we know, but it's saying it well. Tim writes, can civil society have a downside? Of course. Sometimes we become too cliquish or too conformist. The power structures of institutions create opportunities for abuse, as scandals in the Catholic Church and other institutions remind us. To mention scandals in the Catholic Church, and far be it from me to point fingers, being in an institution of higher education, we have these same problems. That our power structures and our code of silence that we wrap around our power structures are pernicious, and they cause harm. And when we have eroding faith in our institutions, we have eroding ability to engage people, the voice of the people, as Tim had said. I think that is one of our greatest challenges. I do a lot of work on the global level, and I'm very interested in our sustainable development goals. Say what you will about the United Nations, there's something kind of compelling about saying, are these things that we as a human race across this entire beautiful world share? And one of those sustainable development goals, I think about it all the time, it's SDG 16, if you'd like to look it up, is about peace, security, and functioning institutions. So I was just in Uganda and Rwanda in a little bit. I'll be in Paris and then in Cape Town, South Africa, talking about what does it mean to have faith in our institutions. And one of the things I talk about a lot is engagement theater, that we have to understand that when we say we want the voice of the people, we better want the voice of the people. We can't just say it. We can't just have engagement theater because we actually cause harm when we do that. And any one of us who have been in any kind of an engagement setting in the public sector with our legislature or in our faith communities or in our kids' schools, we know what it feels like to have somebody say, we really care what you think, when we know you really don't care what I think. So what we know nationally and globally is that engagement theater is a big part of eroding trust when people truly don't feel like their voice matters. So I think our challenge is to think about that. And if there's one thing that I was going to say I would like to challenge Tim on, but I don't think that's true because you ended with this comment, is that I think a lot about something the Reverend Martin Luther King said many years ago when he said 11 o'clock on Sunday morning is the most segregated hour in the American Christian church. I'm not going to cite facts and figures and statistics, but I believe it's still true. And I believe we have a problem with race and our faith communities, and I think that's tragic. I don't think that's Christ-like. And I don't point fingers. I include myself in this. I think it is a huge challenge for all of us. And as a dean of a public school, public institution, I'm intrigued. I don't have the answers yet. I'm working on it. But I'm intrigued by this notion that if that continues to be true, and maybe that's not all bad, we all seek community. You know, we seek a Catholic church or a faith community in our neighborhood. I'm in the Cedar Riverside area where there's the largest Somali population outside of Mogadishu. There's a mosque there that is a very closely knit community for the Cedar Riverside area. I don't know why that's inherently bad. But if that's where our sense of community begins and ends, that is inherently bad. So what is it we could do to think about these civil society institutions, and certainly the church, and also think about this very real phenomena that perhaps the most integrated part of our life is our workplace. Now, I realize I'm speaking to many of you whose profession is the church, so this may not be as true of this audience. But for many of us, we are more integrated racially, economically, politically, and by age and country of origin in our workplace than in our neighborhoods, than any of the institutions we choose to affiliate with, and certainly than our church. So what can we do to think about this notion of our workplaces and our faith communities or the civil societies we choose to engage in, to think about being what I believe Jesus Christ calls us to do, and that is to be radically anti-racist, practice radical hospitality. I don't think it's enough to say we want to love our neighbor. I think that's fundamental. But what do we do if we say we radically choose to act in that way? What would be different in all of our lives? I think that's a huge challenge that we should all consider, and I think we should think about as we read this book. The last thing I want to say is, again, not in defense of public institutions engaging in our, or reflecting our faith, because I do think that there is probably more segregation there than should be. But one of the words that I've been choosing to use a lot in the public sphere, in my role as a dean of a public institution, is the term grace. And when we think about grace in our faith communities, we oftentimes invoke the grace of God, this notion of forgiveness, or, you can be the kind of radically awful adolescent I was and still be loved by the nuns, that kind of grace. But I've been reading a lot about the root of the word grace, the Hebrew origins of that word, and I'm intrigued that in addition to the way it's used in the Bible, there's this notion of grace as a bending towards kindness, as a bending towards openness. And sadly, in the next several days, I will be addressing a pretty serious issue of sexual misconduct in higher education. And I'm going to invoke that word because I think that there is a lot about what Sister Michaela taught me, what we hear in this book about our role in being in community with each other, that is about grace. Not only forgiveness or the grace of God, but our grace towards each other, this notion of bending towards each other, leaning in towards each other in kindness and in openness. And I believe, in fact, that's what we can do in a radical way. And I agree with Tim that that's ultimately what will change our society and change the world. Thank you very much.
So I welcome the Strong Towns followers. I am one of them and can tell you I find the commentary that I receive in my inbox particularly compelling. So I'd encourage you to check out Strong Towns. Charles is a graduate of the University of Minnesota as an undergrad in both the Humphrey School and as a master's in urban and regional planning. He's the author of a number of books, has given many, many presentations on urbanism and urban planning, and I think he's going to offer some unique insights about how the built environment contributes to some of our community building aspirations as well. So grateful to have Charles Brown with us today. Welcome, Charles.
Obviously, there's some recency bias on that Planet Edison poll. I show that to my kids. I have 2 daughters. And I think on that thing that I was ranked number 10, Thomas Jefferson was ranked like 50. And my kid looked at that, and my oldest, and she said, "Dad, there's something wrong with this list." So count on your family to always keep you humble. Thank you. This is a tremendous opportunity, and I'm very, very grateful to be able to come and be part of it. The idea of responding to a book that I read last spring because I knew it was a very good book, had been recommended to me many times, and then had the delightful chance to go back through it again in anticipation of coming here, is something that I was very excited about. I want to build on Tim's comments by talking a little bit about parking, which I'm an engineer and a planner. I think that I get to get a little bit technical with you, maybe more than some of the others here. Years ago, I came up with an obsession, and it was picked up by many people in the Strong Towns conversation, with church parking lots, particularly with church parking lots that have the little sign that says "for parishioners only." Sometimes this sign actually goes a step further and says, "violators will be towed." And what we started to do is we started to take photos of these. I did, and other people around the country started to copy this trend. And we would just hashtag it WWJD, right? Like, what would Jesus do? He would tow you if you parked in the church parking lot illegal, because that's what it's all about. I've been involved as a planner and as an engineer with a number of parishes, both Catholic and non, who were tearing down the neighborhoods around their place in order to create more parking. We just went through, and I got up this morning, I told my wife, I said, I don't think Father Tony's going to be here, our priest from our church up in Brainerd, and I don't have my glasses on, but I don't think he's here, so I'm just going to say this. Please, if you know any of the priests up in Brainerd, please leave my name out of it. They're wonderful people. But we just went through 2 capital campaigns at both of our major churches, and when the presentations were made to the parish, one of the big selling points was, hey, we're going to have more parking. We're going to have additional parking here. And I was like, yeah, well, I can raise money for that. What would Jesus do, right? He would tow you if you parked in the lot. I'm going to come back to parking at the end here, but I want to talk a little bit about the kind of story of America post-World War II. My grandpa in particular, but my grandparents all, my grandpa's kind of the seminal one for me, grew up in the Great Depression. He told me that he lived in a barn of his neighbors. He wound up living there during the Depression. He would work for them, and then they would feed him and allow him to stay in the barn. He was a Marine in World War II. He was the first group to go into Nagasaki after the bomb was dropped. He passed away in 2011, but these stories kind of stick with me because this was a person who was a soft, gentle, kind man, but also had lived through this period of time that, not only defined this generation, but I think, for me, defined who this person was. And it's made me very generous in my thoughts about what this generation did after World War II. When you go through years of depression, you go through this great and terrible war. If you read the economic thinking of the time, there was a general concept that as soon as the war was over and we stopped building bombs and planes and ships, we brought all these millions of young working age men back home, that we would just slide right back into depression. That there was nothing fundamentally different about our economy in 1945 that there was in 1935, and we were going to go right back to what we had experienced. Of course, that's not what happened. And we all know and kind of nostalgize now the story of the post-war boom and how, this greatest generation came back. They took all that productive capacity that we had put towards destruction and put it towards building this great American dream. And we reshaped an entire continent in a generation around a new set of ideas, a new set of ideals, a new way of living. This is, and I wrote this down as Tim was talking, in a sense, the story of America. And the American dream, as it's been passed down to us, is kind of exemplified in a single-family home on a lot with a picket fence. But I wrote down your words as well. When we look at, and this is very Patrick Deneen kind of, inspired as well, the over-centralization and hyper-individualism combined, there's no more emblematic thing than that, than the single-family home. It literally is the epitome of both the over-centralization and the hyper-individualization. Think about this for a sec. Over-centralization, what do you have? You have a home that is not financed locally. It's financed as part of some massive, Wall Street infrastructure. It's sold on to a secondary market set up for this very purpose to, create as robust and broad a housing market as possible. We experienced in 2008 what economists said couldn't happen, which is the 100% correlation of the Minnesota housing market with the California housing market, with the Florida housing market. There's always one. Sometimes it's me. It's okay. You'll find it. They'll hang up. So you look at this product, the single-family home, and you understand that it is the very epitome of top-down centralized policy. Everything from the highways that enabled it, the frontage roads, the overpasses, the interchanges, the financing, the insurance model, the zoning codes and regulations, the international uniform building code, for crying out loud. What we have done is we have hyper-centralized and optimized everything about the construction of this America over and over and over. And this is why you can go here in Minneapolis, in the suburbs of Minneapolis, you can travel down to Florida, you can travel to Texas or California or the Northeast or the Northwest, and what do you see? You see the same thing over and over and over. And we might have, Caribou Coffee, and they might have Starbucks, but it's the same product model over and over again, this hyper-centralization. But on the other hand, you have the hyper-individualism, the idea of the single-family home. It's your home is your castle. And not just your castle from a legal standpoint, but from a metaphorical standpoint too. If you can live, in a sense, in a single-family home in isolation from others, you have achieved what kings and queens and royalty of the past aspired to. The place in the countryside, away from the rabble, away from the problems of others, the problems of community. I just had an opportunity in August, because I fly a lot, I get a lot of frequent flyer miles. I was able to take my family overseas, and my daughters got to experience Paris for the very first time. We went to Versailles, and literally cut their heads off opulence. You're talking about on a grand scale, the gardens, the massive palace, the multiple rooms. Understand that this is the dream that we set out to create. Give every man, every family, give everybody their own castle. And we would be the richest, most successful, most prosperous country in the world. And for a period of time, we were. There was no question that period of time we nostalgize as this grand time when a middle-class family could, live the good life on one blue-collar job and be able to volunteer for the PTA and still have the neighborhood parades and still have the kids in the softball league that you attend all their games. This was a period of time that we look back at today with nostalgia. From a strong town standpoint, we have a very keen understanding of what happened financially. And I won't give you the deep details. Go to our website, strongtowns.org. We talk about this all the time. But basically, when you take a city and you spread it out over a massive area, what you do from an engineering standpoint is you bump up the costs and you diffuse the wealth, the value. And so from just a pure number standpoint, you create a lifestyle that has a huge financial ante for everyone to participate in. You have to own a car. In fact, you have to own 2 cars. You have to go great distances and spend a lot of your time and energy to get anywhere. When you do this enough in a place, you start to create traffic congestion. There's a magnifying, multiplying effect to this. When you look at all those pipes and all the roads and all the stuff that we built, there's a maintenance cost, like an echo that comes back 25, 30 years later, that all of a sudden now a denuded tax base has to take care of. When we look at photos of cities, be it Minneapolis, St. Paul, be it other places around North America, when we look at aerial photos of them in 1945 and we compare them to today, there's one overwhelming feature that just hits us across the face. And that is parking. Our cities are nothing today but huge gaps, huge amounts of parking. And if you think about this, I want to tie this into Tim's talk by pointing out that what parking is an unspace. It's the absence of space. From an engineering standpoint, a parking lot is a financial disaster. You look at it, and when you stand in a parking lot today somewhere, I want you to look and realize that there's millions of dollars of pipe in the ground around it. There's hundreds of thousands of dollars of curb and gutter and drainage and sidewalk and asphalt. It's all there just to temporarily store your vehicle. It is gluttony and materialism made manifest at a scale that is unimaginable. And it's unimaginable because we've just accepted it as a society as being so. But if you look at parking, what you realize from a social standpoint that it is literally an unplace. It is the opposite of place. I looked this up because I heard this before and I wanted to make sure I got it right. The word parish comes from a Greek word, and the Greek word actually means dwelling aside or dwelling nearby. And when I think of a parish, you think of the community that you're trying to build. Parking is literally the antithesis of of dwelling aside. It's literally the antithesis of being present and being there. When we look at ecosystems, one of the things that ecologists talk about as the greatest threat to natural ecosystems is fragmentation. The idea of fragmenting a forest, what it does is it cuts off animals, creatures that would normally interact with each other in complex ways that computer models or scientists that study one species or another are not able to fully grasp and understand. Ecosystems are complex adaptive environments. When we run roads through the middle, when we separate them and cut them off, not only do we see this show up oftentimes in the apex species, but we see this fragmentation and inbreeding and different very destructive things happen at the local, at the very kind of small level. What we have done with our development pattern not only has put our cities, our neighborhoods, our communities in financially very difficult position, but we have, as intentional policy, fragmented our very places in the same way that we see our ecosystems fragmented. Our human ecosystems have been split apart. When we can't cross the street to get to the store goes out of business. When we can't walk 2 blocks because we're afraid of how fast the cars go, or we can't let our kids go outside and bike because we're worried they're going to get run over. When we can't live next to the church because the church is surrounded by acres of parking, what we have done is we've fragmented ourselves from each other. And we've done it at tremendous, tremendous cost. The Dutch, I'm good. The Dutch overcame the fragmented system in your book. And I think largely this is because of their commitment to community. If we want to get serious about building the kind of world that Tim lays out, the kind of world that I think we all want to live in and experience, we have to have a commitment to lowering the bar of entry to that world. We have to make it easier to be part of community. And that means instead of building parking lots, we need to build places. Thank you so very much.
Chuck was great, and thank you for that. And in a time where we know more about the identity of Trump's lawyers than we do our local county commissioners or city councilmen, the point about the built environment is well taken. So thank you, and it gives us more grist for consideration. Greater Minnesota is well represented by our respondents today, and I'm delighted to welcome Deacon Steve Pareja to be a panelist and respondent this morning. He is the Executive Director of Catholic Charities of the Diocese of St. Cloud and is a deacon in the Catholic Church. Prior to his leadership of Catholic Charities, he was in healthcare administration and sales. He and his wife Donna have 2 children and live in St. Cloud, and he is the very definition of a servant leader and a delightful gentleman. It's been great getting to know you, Deacon Steve. So welcome, Steve Pareja.
Well, if you didn't notice, Jason whispered in my ear to stretch until about 2:30, so I'll see if I can accommodate you there. As indicated, I am the Executive Director of Catholic Charities of the Diocese of St. Cloud. I'm also a deacon, where I've been serving in my parish in Sartell since I was ordained in 2006. I'm very active in my parish. I'm very active in my ministry. I feel as though I get to do God's work each and every day. But it hasn't always been that way. I was born a cradle Catholic. My parents sent me, as I grew up in rural Indiana, sent me to a Catholic grade school through 8th grade. I didn't have the opportunity to go to a Catholic high school because the closest one was about an hour and a half away. So it was at that point in my life that I started drifting away from the church. I wasn't attending church on a regular basis, and by the time I got to college, I couldn't remember the last time I had graced the doorway of a church. And I seemed quite fine with it. And if you had asked me as I was an undergraduate at Indiana University in Bloomington, Indiana, what my faith meant to me, I wouldn't have had much of a story. At that point in my life, I would have thought that I had left the church. But what I realized when I got older was I had never left the church. I just quit practicing my faith. You see, the gift that my parents gave me was my faith foundation. And I realized that throughout life, as I was coming up to making decisions, I was falling back on my faith, and I didn't even realize it. Let me put this in perspective. The Catholic grade school where I graduated from 8th grade was a class of 23. Then I moved to the public high school, and that class graduated 360. So you can imagine going from a class of 23 to a class of 360, I quickly felt lost in the crowd. I had lost my identity, I had lost my direction. I was just one of many. And then I graduated and started my undergraduate studies at Indiana University, whose enrollment at the time for undergraduates was about 32,000. So I went from 23 to 360 to 32,000. I had lost who I was along the way, I thought, but I had the foundation of faith. As I read Scripture, what I understand my life to be is the story of Emmaus. And I was one of those disciples walking along down the road, and I never realized that Jesus was walking with me the entire time. And every time I got to a crossroads somewhere in my life, when I knew that here was a path that I could take, and I might know where I would end up, and maybe that path was not going to lead me someplace good. And here's a path over here that I had no idea where that destination was, but I had faith and hope I would take that journey. And I realize and I believe that as Jesus walked next to me, what he was doing was he was never pushing me in either direction. He was gently nudging me. So he nudged me down this path. He nudged me into finding my wife, who is far more faithful than I will ever be. She's the one who invited me back to church. She's the one who encouraged me to join her, but she never mandated it. She invited me to come back with her, and as I sat in the pew and as I listened to the homilies, I realized that I was back in church because I wanted to be there. Now, my wife shares my vocation in healthcare. Believe it or not, before I was doing any of this, I was an X-ray tech, doing CAT scans and MRI. My wife is an X-ray tech as well. She and I met in college. I'm aging myself when I say I bumped into her into the dark room and things developed. She hates it when I tell that story. But anyway, she and I are in healthcare together. And because of her job at the hospital, she was oftentimes on call. So when she would get called into the hospital and it was Sunday and I went to our parish where we were celebrating together, where we had become parishioners after we got married. This was a parish that I wasn't really actively involved in. And when I say that, I mean I was not part of a ministry. I wasn't a lector. I wasn't a Eucharistic minister. And this was long before I even thought about becoming a deacon. I would sit in the same pew because that's what we all do, right? I was sitting in the same pew and all of the other parishioners whom we had developed a community with that I didn't even realize was a community, they would see that I was there alone. And at the end of Mass, these little old ladies would tap me on the shoulder and they'd say, "Excuse me, where's your wife today?" And I'd say, "Oh, she's on call at the hospital. She's in, taking care of somebody else." And they said, "Oh, I thought since she wasn't here, she might be sick, so I spent the Mass praying for her." I realized that I had become part of a parish community, and I hadn't even actively tried to do that. So, in my ministry as a deacon, in my role at Catholic Charities, oftentimes people will come up to me and they will ask me, how can I find greater satisfaction in my life? How can I live a better life? How can I be happier? And until I read Tim's book, my answer was simply, go to church more. Go to church more. You'll find grace, you'll find love, you'll find community in church. And they would look at me and they'd go, "Okay, deacon," and they'd walk away. Well, now I've got this book that says, you know what, there's a whole bunch of studies and a whole bunch of surveys and a whole bunch of articles that support that if we're part of a community and if we're part of a religious community, we'll live better, happier lives. And that's one of the things that I feel graced about, is the opportunity to be part of a parish community, to be part of a stronger life. I'm more satisfied in the work that I do. Although, at the same time, I'm saddened a bit, because what I see in my own local parish is, over the 13 years that I've been ordained, as I sit next to the altar serving with my pastor, I look out into the congregation, and it seems like there's fewer and fewer and fewer there each Sunday. Now, you know, in our particular community, we know that there's a lot of people who go up north to their cabins on the weekends, so we spend a lot of time saying, oh, well, this is the summer pattern. After Labor Day, this place will be packed. I'm still waiting for that. I'm not seeing as many people come back. The other thing that I see is I see that the most engaged families in our parishes, the ones who have their kids enrolled in our school, they're extremely active in our parish until their kids graduate. And then they have a tendency to drift away and drift away and drift away. In our parish, there's probably about 20 families that do about 90% of the work in the parish, the volunteerism, the ministry. Is my church alone in this? Probably not. So I try to figure out, how can we encourage people to come back to church? How do we get people to come back and be part of the community? And I feel that my role as a minister of God is to try to give people a reason to come back. So what I try to do in my preaching and in my homilies is I try to encourage people to come back. And why? I read the scripture, I read the gospel, and as I look at that scripture for the weekend, I'm trying to uncover and peel back the layers of the onion as to why that scripture is relevant in our world today, and let me connect it to you. Because if I can't take the beauty of the scripture and the ritual of the liturgy and make it relevant in your lives today, why would I expect you to come back next week? So if this is an education day for our bishops and our priests and our deacons, let me offer this. As you're preparing your homilies, as you're sitting down and talking with parishioners, what can we do to make church relevant to our lives today? I have been blessed because just over 2.5 years ago, my bishop, Bishop Don Kettler, asked me, he didn't ask it this way, this is how I heard it. He said, Deacon Steve, would it be possible for you to come to Catholic Charities and exercise your ministry each and every day in everything you do? He asked me if I would come to Catholic Charities and be the executive director. Now, I'm a person who used to take x-rays, CAT scans, MRIs. I used to sell them. I used to work in administration of hospitals. I did not have on my radar anywhere being the executive director of a social concerns agency, of social services. And when I was encouraged by some board members to apply for this role, I really prayed and discerned on it, because it was an opportunity for me to live out my ministry, my calling from God each and every day in everything that I do. And I'm so blessed to get to do that, because what I get to do is I get to lead an incredible group of people who do exactly what Tim says that we need to do, or he highlighted today. We need to take care of the poor. We need to take care of the hungry. We need to take care of those in need. And that's exactly what we get to do at Catholic Charities in St. Cloud. That's what happens at Catholic Charities all over the United States, all around the world. That's what happens when you're part of a social services organization. You get to help others. Now, I know a lot of organizations, other Catholic charities, do very similar things that we do. We don't do everything, but there's a lot of things that we do. We have about 30 programs within the Diocese of St. Cloud that really focus on social concerns. We have a social concerns department that really focuses on the needs of the people in our communities, the people that we serve. And as Bishop often reminds me, we are the hands and feet of the charitable work of the Diocese of St. Cloud. Bishop asks me on a regular basis, Steve, make sure you're serving the people. Make sure you're doing it well. And what we do is we provide things like a food shelf. A food shelf that is the third largest food shelf in the state of Minnesota, the largest one outside of the Twin Cities. We're very proud of that. We have housing services for people who are who need affordable housing. We have housing services for veterans. We have a mental health clinic. We have group homes for people who are dealing with persistent mental health issues. We have group homes for people who have developmental disabilities. And we have transitional homes for homeless women with children, women without children, and homeless youth. We serve the poor, we serve the homeless, we serve those with mental illness, we serve those with disabilities, and we do it with volunteers. We have about 350 employees serving on an annual basis about 53,000 people in need, and we can't do it alone. And it's our volunteers who help us out. We have nearly 3,000 volunteers that help us on a regular basis. There was like 293,000 hours that was volunteered last calendar year, and I did the math, and it breaks down to 112 FTEs that volunteered their time. We couldn't do it alone. So one of the things that Tim asked us at the end of it is, he was here with the problem. What is the solution? The solution is great people like you and people in your parishes who are giving of their time, talent, and treasures to help anyone in need. Tim, I want to thank you because you wrote a book that has given me information for about the next 37 homilies. So I really appreciate this. If you have not had the opportunity to read the book, I absolutely encourage you to read the book. It was such a great inspirational read for me. I even actually read the notes, the footnotes at the end. It was incredible. Take the time to read this, because what this is this will help you realize why your Christian faith, your Catholic faith, your love can be put into practice in everything you do. Thank you very much.
But also has served as a legislator representing District 21B for 3 terms. Brad and his wife have 7 children, so he's obviously a very busy guy. We're pleased to welcome today Brad Finstead.
Well, good morning. I feel like this, I had to chuckle a little bit. This is kind of a start of maybe a bad joke, but you walk in to give a speech, and there in the audience is your bishop, your wife, your family doctor, and your favorite priest. I don't know the punchline yet, but maybe you can all help me work on that as this goes. But it's not too often I get to do this with so many great friends in the audience. But I appreciate the invite for being here. And Tim, I want to congratulate you on quite an accomplishment, and that accomplishment from the arena that I come from, that policy political world, you've made Democrats mad and Republicans mad with your book. So in policy, we would say you've probably struck the right chord. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my background just to lay the casework, and I'll give you some data that helps me drive decisions, and then hopefully we can get to a couple solutions, and I look forward to the panel. So I cut my teeth in rural policy working for U.S. House Member of Congress, Mark Kennedy, who I know a lot of you know. I did that for about 2 years, focusing on rural and ag policy, traveling the back roads and gravel roads of rural Minnesota, specifically Southwest. From there, I went on to serve in the legislature for 3 terms. I had the honor of getting elected by my family and friends. My wife pretty much got me there with all of the door knocking that we did together. I had the honor of representing a very rural district. I represented Laura Ingalls Wilder, Chief Sleepy Eye, Herman the German, and Shell's Beer. So there was a lot of diversity, but also a lot of just great people, and that is still our home today in New Ulm. And then I, for 10 years, worked as the executive director for the Center of Rural Policy and Development, and that is a statewide organization that's day in, day out studying issues of importance to rural Minnesota and trying to put the lens of policy on those issues, so as we spoke to the legislature, the governor, and elected officials, to help them understand that what they were doing and how that would affect everyday folks in rural Minnesota. And now I've had the honor to accept a presidential appointment to run the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Rural Development Division in the state of Minnesota. So I oversee about 100 employees and about $1 billion of your tax dollars administered through this state and through this agency each year. So my work and my life has been devoted to rural Minnesota. But most importantly, I would say is that I'm a dad of 7 children, a husband, and a Catholic. So this forms my view of the world, this forms my work, and this really inspires me to do well. First day of school today, 5 kids in school? Yep. My wife is here because 7 kids are in school today at the Catholic school in New Ulm. So how does it feel, honey? No kids? Well, great. So to lay out a little bit about what forms our decision-making in the agencies that I've worked with and how I look at rural issues, I want to just go over a data set with all of you to try to frame the issue a little bit more. Tim traveled the country and talked maybe in more generic terms from pieces and places all over the country. Mine's going to zone in a little bit more about our backyard and specifically rural Minnesota. So we do a lot of things great. We produce a lot of things with our hands, and there is a lot of great pride in that. As a state, agriculture production, we're #1 in the country for turkeys and sugar beets. And I always like to joke, turkeys, I mean, look at our politics, right? I mean, that makes sense, right? #2, we're in hogs, sweet corn, and peas. We are #3 in the country of producing pigs and soybeans. And feeder pigs, so there's a little difference between breeding pigs and feeder pigs. And then #4 in corn. So we are a very large egg-producing state, and we have quite a bit of skin in the game in our rural economy in that area. From a workforce and employment perspective, we are right now faced with a lot of things that Tim has outlined in his book. We are seeing huge disparities in wages from our rural communities and our metro communities. We are being outpaced in every sector in regards to earning and earning potential, and it's been that way for quite some time. #1 employer in rural Minnesota is in the industry of healthcare and education. The #2 areas of employment are the trades, transportation, and utilities. And the #3 areas are of agriculture and manufacturing. And I point that out because, a lot of you that are at the pulpit Sunday, it's nice to know who you're talking to. And that's what's driving the economy in rural Minnesota. Now, that's the lay of the land. I talked about the wage discrepancies. An effect of that, I think, is what we see, and we are bleeding our 20 to 30-year-olds like crazy. All rural counties in Minnesota in the last 10 years have lost 20 to 30-year-olds. We're at a net loss. But there is some hope. We have seen some pockets of growth. The University of Minnesota, Ben Winchester Extension has talked about brain gain. We have seen pockets of rural Minnesota that has been able to attract the 30 to 40-year-olds. So again, good for you to know. So as you look at how do we build community, how do we work as a parish to include our neighbors, those that are disenfranchised, those that are isolated, look to that age group that, what can we do to make a difference to that 20 to 30-year-old? What can we do to welcome that 30 to 40-year-old family that is choosing to come back to rural Minnesota for one reason or another? That's a challenge I think that we have. But again, it's to understand the data and know your community and know your backyard. When we got involved in politics, it struck me right away that some of the issues that we care near and dear about as a family seem so far away. It was so hard to figure out how could we change the unbelievable, horrific abortion rates? How can we change the tax and spend policies that we don't agree with? And I had a good, wise mentor early on that said, you cannot change any of that unless you can change your backyard first. And I think that's a good lesson for us, and specifically in rural Minnesota, and from a church and a parish perspective, that we need to do better at changing our backyard. A lot of these other things will settle in place if we can look in our backyard and say it's different. And I'll give you one example. And Bishop, I'm not kissing up to you. You're here. So there's a lot of us in the New Ulm area, and I'm looking around the room, that care near and dear about the life issue and have worked very hard on the pro-life movement. And year in, year out, we would see the numbers, and we would be frustrated with how can we make a difference? Is it even happening in our communities, or is this a Twin Cities issue? And so a group of folks in our local community got together and said, let's change our backyard. And so we started from nowhere. We started from prayer, a crisis pregnancy center. And what are we at, 120 babies saved through that? Right there in Little New Ulm, Little New Ulm. But we changed our backyard. We're changing our backyard. Now, that didn't happen because some of us were just smart and figured it out. That happened because we had a welcoming relationship with our parish and our bishop. We had folks that were able to take us in and foster our ideas and help us learn from maybe mistakes or challenges that others have faced. But it was that welcoming inclusion that created a relationship and not a transaction that allowed us to make a difference in our own backyard. So I would just say that as we look at these population trends and the demographic changes, let's really focus on our backyard, because that I see playing out more and more in rural Minnesota. The successes that Tim points out are all successes driven in the backyard. It didn't take big government to say, hey, we're going to provide social services at the local level through our church. That is one thing that I think I got out of the book, and then it resonates very well with the work that I do in rural development. I would say that the other thing is we have to acknowledge the reality of what we look like. And it was alluded to a little bit by previous speakers, but the face of rural Minnesota has changed. We have more funerals than baptisms. Did you guys know that? I'm sure you feel that more than most. We are in most counties losing that productive working age 20 to 30-year-old. And then the counties that have expressed growth in the last 10 years are completely attributed to the non-white population growth. So I was listening to the state demographer one day, and she said that in rural Minnesota, you're getting older, browner, and you're sometimes bringing back these 30 to 40-year-olds. So it was kind of a mixed bag. But the fact of the matter is, do what we do in our backyard, does that reflect that current demographic change that we see happening? And it's very, this is all tied together, so I'll look at Nobles County. Nobles County, Worthington area, in the last 10 years, lost about 6,000 white people. They gained about 8,200 non-white folks in that same 10 years. So it's a net gain. The biggest employer there is a Swift packing plant, which is directly tied to that hog production that I talked about. So all of this is cyclical. It all matters to each other, and I think we need to pay attention to that and make sure that we are doing what we can to create more relationships and less transactions. And I would close on that. Coming from the state level, and before I forget, representatives that are here, thank you for your service. I know the trenches and they're tough, so thank you. Thank your family, because I know that's such a sacrifice, so thanks for your service. From state government, from federal government, and through the research angle, the goal is to create more efficiencies and effective government, and with that sometimes comes centralization. And when you look at centralization of government, whatever services, you lose that hand-touching, hand-holding relationship. And we become all about transactions. We're nothing more than a Taco John's drive-through. And I'll give you an example. Last week, and I'm embarrassed to say this, I signed over $40 million of grants and loans for communities all across rural Minnesota, and I have no idea the key players in each one of them, because it came up through the bureaucracy, and I was the person at the top that had to sign off on it. Think of the day of when, we had an intimate relationship with these folks, and we understood their needs and their wants and their future goals, and to get to the point about planning a community based on the next 60 years, not the last, that is being lost. So I think that's an opportunity that we as a church have. I think that's an opportunity as we in rural Minnesota have to really take a good look at our backyard. And I would just say, and I would close, I had the honor of being invited by the bishop to join a lot of you in Florida a few years ago on the conference on the new evangelization. And what struck me is that when Pope Francis talks about reaching those on the fringes, how are we going to do that? Are we going to do that in our churches Sunday morning from 10 to 11? Or are we going to do it on the street every day, day in, day out, living that life and creating relationships? And I know there's only so many of you, but I look at our life and the great friends and great religious that we have in our community, the handmaids of the heart of Jesus, but just amazing. The way that they're able to reach out to our communities and actually create authentic relationships that bring people to the church. That's what it's about. And we'll see the effects in all of these things that I talked about, whether it be demographics or economics or quality of life. And so I look forward to the conversation. As a fellow knuckle dragger, I appreciate you inviting one dud to the group. So thank you all.
The odd tension was brought up by two of you. Fragmentation, you talked about, but also an us and them thing. you can't have an us without there being a them, yet we want there to be inclusion. And so this is a natural tension, and I think it's one that in modern politics and cultural discussions we're really bad at discussing. People get upset, conservatives get upset if they look and say, look, all these Somali immigrants are all clustering together, they're not getting to know anybody, the adults aren't learning to speak English, they're gathering, they've got their own religion, and that can rub you the wrong way if it cuts against an older way of doing something. And a lot of times, you'll have liberals get upset by saying you're joining a private club that has its own rules, or you're setting up your school with certain ways. You're only hiring people who share your values. But at some level, we need to belong to an us that sets its own rules, but the thing that I think makes America exceptional is that we belong to things on so many different levels. I'll mention it. It's a swim club, which is not a Catholic organization. It's a parish, which is local. We send our kids to schools, all boys school, all girls school in Maryland and Northern Virginia, and that's not a local thing, but we belong to civic things, we belong to governmental things, we belong to so many different things, and that they have to be able to exist side by side. So we work with one of the Orthodox synagogues near us. The end of my book is sort of calling for a much more robust involvement of the parallel institutions, the ones that don't have overlap. The Reformed Church, the Catholic Church, and the synagogue, the people there overlap in the same playground, the same public schools, but those institutions should work together. So the fact that we belong to so many different things ought to ameliorate some of our worry of belonging to something that keeps out of them. But one more thing that was touched on here. Again, we send no parishioners live within walking distance of St. Andrew Apostle and Silver Spring because it's bracketed by the two Orthodox synagogues. So those houses are just worth a lot more to you if you're not allowed to walk, you're not allowed to drive to church. So we have to drive there. We send our older kids to a great all-boys school called the Heights, our oldest daughter to a great all-girls school called Oakcrest. These things are these intense, tightly knit institutions that we love. But we expend a lot of resources, money, both tuition, having 2 cars. My wife drove to, an incredibly complicated carpool route this morning. I was watching her. You guys have that Find My Friends app? It's like really stressful to watch what she had to pull off this morning. We are a married family that can afford 2 cars, that can afford these tuitions, that have flexibility of work. My wife's able to stay at home because I work 3 jobs. And so we assemble, through great effort, the community bonds that ought to be as easy as stepping out on your front porch. And so this is one reason that the elites have stronger community. A, the places they live, like Chevy Chase, are more likely to have just that front porch thing. But B, we can afford to go through the massive efforts to assemble these institutions, and the middle class and the working class can. And that was less true. That distinction was less true 2 generations ago and before that.
Here's a question that maybe Brad and Chuck can both speak to. The questioner says, small towns are urban places. Their main streets are not much different than Grand Avenue here in St. Paul, but yet they seem to be turning from small towns to small suburbs with an auto-centric pattern. Will focusing on re-urbanizing and densifying small towns help build community and attract younger people, those 20 to 30-year-olds who seem to want more urban living and community?
Yes. Not to belabor it too much, but the short answer is yes. I think the only nuance I would add to that, just for the way to think about this, oftentimes we look at small towns when we're not from a small town, or when we think of them as planners or as bureaucrats working through a system. We think of them as just smaller versions of a large city. So you have Minneapolis, St. Paul, you have first-ring suburbs, second-ring suburbs, third-ring suburbs, exurbs. You can go to my little town of Brainerd. You can go to New Ulm. You can look and say, well, it's the same thing here. It's a central city, and then they've got a kind of a first-ring and it's way different. It's way different. And I'll give you one difference from my profession. If you're a bad city planner, in a suburb of Minneapolis and you lose your job, you can actually get another job as a bad city planner somewhere else. If you're a bad city planner in a small town and you lose your job, you have to switch professions or leave that community entirely. That changes everything about how you do your job, how you interact with people, the things you recommend. Now take that, and my world is planning and engineering, and just manifest that in everything else. X-rays and CAT scans, being the doctor at the hospital. It's a very different human ecosystem that you're in a small town. And when we think about it as the city-suburb relationship, what we have to identify in a small town is that it's far more fragile than that. What has been lost in big cities by building suburbs and exurbs is magnified 100 times when you get to a small town. It's devastating, devastating. Please.
I would just comment that, long are the days of the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, the blacksmith on every main street. I mean, the main street has changed. But highlighting the facts that I talked about a little bit earlier, that 30 to 40-year-old demographic that we're looking at, they are little by little trying to change these main streets. And I can give you a bunch of examples, but I'll give you one close to home, and that's Sleepy Eye. Sleepy Eye, Minnesota. We have a 30-plus-year-old doctor that is redoing the movie theater, creating a little coffee shop, things that 30 to 40-year-olds want. I think a microbrewery even. I mean, what, a movie, beer, coffee? Awesome, right? So, again, it's a fine line, though, because you don't want government coming in and saying this is what the ideal Main Street, rural Minnesota needs to look like. You have to know your backyard. You have to have those relationships.
This is a question for Dean Bloomberg, but anyone else who wants to, feel free to respond too. Part of the challenge of our public discourses today is that we have to say that we have to make normative judgments about things, that there are some things that are good and better than other things, whether it's policy, whether it's about family fragmentation, all these really difficult topics that people want to tread around and dance around because it's often uncomfortable. I'm going to combine two questions here to focus this a little bit more. As we take our opinions and ideas to the public square, how can we better listen to others with different views? And similarly, how do we overcome the fear of the vulnerability that occurs when we truly engage and include others? Wow, great questions. And of course, I have the one right answer to that. I can tell you a couple of things. First, I just have to quickly comment that I think about what you were just saying about city planners in small communities, and the Humphrey School prepares a disproportionate number of a large percentage of all of the planners in Minnesota, and so that feels like a clarion call to us to not screw it up. To the question, a couple of things. First of all, I'm not plugging this book because it's nowhere near as interesting as Tim's book, but a few years ago, a colleague of mine and I published an edited volume called Creating Public Value in a Multi-Sector Shared Power World. And it was to this question of how is it that we listen with intention and with attention to people whose views are different than ours, without in any way compromising our own core values. And it's a skill that some would argue has been lost. So we got very tactical about it at the Humphrey School. We actually we talk often about 4 agreements that we ask our students to truly try to practice. One is to be willing in those conversations to experience discomfort, not shy away from discomfort. Be willing to speak your truth. Don't compromise speaking about your own values in the interests of not being uncomfortable. Be willing to accept non-closure, which is a really hard thing. Oftentimes we go, well, I can't even talk about this because we're never going to resolve it, so let's just not talk about it. Speak your truth. Experience discomfort, accept non-closure, and then also listen with honest intent, which is very different than listening with the intention to respond with the pithiest comeback you possibly can, which is really not listening at all. Those don't fix these issues, but when you develop that muscle, that habit, it creates a different kind of environment for those conversations. I think we're all very, very concerned that if we listen to each other across our ideological or our values differences, we somehow are conveying assent or agreement. And if we can let go of that and exercise different muscles, I think we can go a long ways towards hearing each other better.
And just quickly, everybody's going to disagree, and this is part of the reason that we need to have people belonging to so many different things. So the rancor on the national political level is because people don't like the fact that somebody holds a different view. And you know what? If I'm the assistant baseball coach and the head baseball coach has a totally different way of doing it, there's a real problem there. But if we're in different leagues, then there's not a problem. So if you belong to 1,000 different things, you can be just fine with somebody else totally disagreeing with you. But so much of politics now on the national level is we need to stop those people from being wrong. American system with its million little platoons and overlapping institutions has been a way that it can be a peace treaty. Yeah, you can be wrong in that corner, and where we interact, we're going to have basic agreement, and where we don't interact, we don't have to have that much of an agreement.
I'll start with Deacon Steve, but anyone can jump in on this one. Where does the desire and energy required to invest in our communities come from, and how is the effort sustained?
It comes from the heart. You know, you need to understand who you're living with, who you're serving, and why you're doing it. It's important to understand that the person that's sitting across the table from you is probably more similar to you than they are different. They might look different. They might go to a different kind of faith facility, house of God than you do. They may have a different holy day than you do. But by and large, these are good people who are filled with faith, who want to do good things. You know, as we were talking a little bit earlier, just a minute ago, it's really making sure that we open our ears and our minds and our hearts to listen to what someone else is asking for. Because when you get to the end of it, a lot of times the differences are not that different. You know, if we're talking politically, they may sound very polarizing, but if you're sitting across the table having coffee with somebody who's trying to figure out how to make the mortgage, or how to get the kids to school, or how to find enough clothes, those are issues that a lot of us have. And if we just pause long enough to listen to the other person, I think that's key to it. The other thing that I've had to learn in my personal life is when somebody starts telling me their story, I have to let them finish their story before I jump in to try to solve the problem for them. I want to be one of those individuals that's a fixer. I can fix that problem and let's move on. Because what I found in a lot of my ministerial roles, leadership roles, what I found is sometimes it's not until the individual gets to their third or fourth issue that they really start uncovering what their biggest concern is. So let them tell their entire story and then start asking those questions. Where can I help you first? And you may be able to say, I can help you in these two areas, but these three, I don't have the answer. Let me see if I can help somebody else find that for you. It's being open and listening to somebody else's story, because I think there's more commonality than differences in many cases.
If I could, I fully agree with that answer. Let me give you a built environment analog. If you have to own a car, you spend, on average, a typical family, $8,500 a year per car. So if you're a family of two and you're struggling and you're working a number of jobs and what have you, and you can somehow live in a place where you can go from 2 cars to 1 car, you'll save over $8,000 a year. And if you look at that in terms of a house, it's about $120,000 worth of mortgage you could buy if you shift that from a car payment and gas and oil and maintenance and all that into housing. Well, I look at my town of Brainerd, that's a house. I mean, in a lot of neighborhoods, like that's more than what a house costs. So when we are talking about the time it takes to commit and be, first of all, if we can just lower the burden to exist in our places, we free up a lot of people who don't have time today to exist to actually do that. I'll go back to the parking thing earlier too. In my hometown, we asked people, we had these public meetings and we asked them in our engagement, do you think we should build a parking lot? And the answer was yes, we think we should have more parking. There should always be more parking. And then we asked the same group of people, where do you live and where do you work? And this was a group we went out to engage with of people who tended to be not listened to, so younger, poorer, a little more disenfranchised. And like 1 of 20 people owned a car. I don't know why they want more parking. None of them drive. But when we asked them where they lived and where they worked, they would point on maps, and they were miles apart. And then we would ask the follow-up question, which is so obvious at this point: how do you get there? How do you get there in February when it's 25 below? And the answer is they walk. They walk miles in the snow and the ice. And so the challenge that we had was, let's go out there in February and do that. Let's do that with them. Let's experience that the way they experience that. Because what you find very quickly is that we can sit and lament, oh, why are more people not engaging? Why aren't more people volunteering? What can we do to try to entice them? When you have to spend an hour walking through the frigid snow to get to your part-time job at a fast food place, that, by the way, if they don't have enough customers that day, you're going to get let go after just 3 hours of work and forced to trudge back home in that, you don't have a lot of time and effort for the hard work of community building. And it is hard work.
A question that is on many people's minds, especially, Tim, as we talk about the little platoons of society and social groups, how do we balance that sense of belonging and engaging with one another and forming groups and institutions without being exclusive? I mean, one of the boogeymen of political discourse today is tribalism. Your colleague at AEI, Jonah Goldberg, this is what he spends his time railing against. How do we belong to one group without alienating ourselves from other groups or being exclusive in a negative sense of the term?
I think it's wrong-headed to use tribalism as simply a bad word. Humans are tribal animals. We're supposed to belong to things. And in fact, I think it's long been known, and police have long known, that the kids who join street gangs are the kids who don't belong to something else. And I think modern application, the white guys who become white nationalists are overwhelmingly white guys who don't belong to something else. Even the stories from ISIS, was this one ISIS bride said, this was the first time I belonged to something and felt needed. I mean, it's the same story as a street gang and as a white nationalism. So on one level, being part of a little platoon is a counterweight, but on the other level, yeah, as I was saying earlier, if you belong to something and it's sort of got defined limits, then there are people who don't belong to it. Now, on the other hand, the things I belong to, like anybody, there's no cap, there's no price to belong to St. Andrew Apostle. There is a price, but there's no waiting list or anything to join my swim club. A lot of these things that we belong to, some of them you can just really be open. But I would reemphasize, I don't even like the term melting pot. I think of a quote work that you should be adjacent and friendly with the other institutions. You should make sure that you belong to more than just one thing so that you're getting diversity, diverse experiences in your own life. Hopefully then you'll bring them into the different institutions you belong to. But so I would say don't be afraid of having an us that's at odds in some level with a them. But if you belong to more things, then everybody who's a them on one question, hopefully a lot of them will be us's in another question.
I think one of the things to point out is when you think of the term little platoon and exclusivity, remember that, when we think of platoon, we think of the military environment. And a platoon is part of a larger company that's part of an army. And then that army is also part of a larger set of armed forces. So, as we talk about little platoon here, make sure we don't close our minds to think that, my little platoon at St. Francis Xavier in Sartell is part of a larger Catholic community that's part of a larger Christian community, and it just rolls on and on and on. It's just how we subset each other to get work done. In our workplaces, many times we set up task forces to get things done. A task force is a mini platoon. It's not necessarily exclusive, and you may not even want to be part of that task force, but you're called upon it to be part of it so that you can get the work done. So don't think of little platoon as an exclusive negative. It's part of a larger group.
A question regarding the existential divide between rural Minnesota and urban Minnesota, and invite any of the panelists to jump in, but maybe ask Dean Bloomberg and Brad Finstead specifically to address how do we overcome that seemingly growing existential divide between rural and urban Minnesota.
I think that a lot of the comments that my fellow panelists and Tim have made speak to that. Sleepy Eye is a great example. I think you probably know Kelly Ash, who is a graduate of the Humphrey School and is truly a small-town Minnesota evangelical. And he has taught me a lot. He was my advisee when he was a student, and he's taught me a lot about what we as a school have done wrong in terms of perpetuating that divide. Unintentionally, but the capital is in St. Paul. We place a lot of interns in St. Paul or in Washington, D.C. There's a couple of things that are happening naturally that I think are starting to change this. One is, regardless of politics, the fact that in this administration, we pulled away from the Paris Climate Agreement, and what we saw was that small towns and mid-sized towns and municipalities, in fact, stepped up and did things on their own to address some of the environmental protections that were a part of that agreement, really inspired a lot of young policy wonks in policy schools, not only at the Humphrey School, but across the country. And it is changing, I think, a focus on what is relevant and valuable and good and desirable about small towns across this country. I think that's a very positive thing. And very practically, we're doing two things. One, we're adding a class on rural policy, and an increasing number of students are taking it. Two, we're launching a whole series of initiatives in memory of Jane Freeman, the former First Lady of Minnesota, who felt very strongly about rural Minnesota and rural parts of the country in general, and launching a series of paid internships, because it's not easy for somebody who's got an apartment in Minneapolis as a student to go to a small town for the summer and find a place to live and intern. So we want to create funding for that so that more of our students understand just how awesome it is to be in New Ulm or Sleepy Eye or Windham, any number of places in the state that exciting and innovative things are happening.
So I've only been asked this question about 10,000 times over the last 20 years, that what is the rural-urban divide, how do we fix it? I don't think there's a way to fix it, but I do think that we can continue to work on some of the things that maybe have created that divide and made it worse. You know, I highlighted the wage gap. If you're in the farthest northwest corner of rural Minnesota and you're on the line doing a manufacturing job, making $20 an hour, and that same exact job in Shakopee is about $35, $40, that's a hard pill to swallow. You are struggling maybe with house payments, car payments, and at some point you possibly pull the trigger and say, I'm moving to Shakopee. So we see that happening quite often. So I think that, you know, being real is part of it. We have to be real, that there is some differences between rural and urban, and there's the economies of what makes, like I highlighted, we can grow a lot of pigs in rural Minnesota. It's not going to work well in Minneapolis or St. Paul. So there's just some differences, and that's okay. I mean, it's okay to be different. We also have to acknowledge the fact that you look at the population that we're bleeding in rural Minnesota, that 20 to 30-year-old. I mean, they're moving to the cities. That's where they're going. They're going to the metro areas, Rochester, Duluth, Minneapolis, St. Paul, St. Cloud. That is where that age group is going. How we get those folks back is potentially part of the answer to the rural-urban divide, you know, because you have folks that now maybe understand both worlds, so to speak. We also have a political disconnect. You know, a lot of the political fights are boundary fights. And we can talk about tons of different examples, but let's just talk about light rail, for example. You talk about light rail funding in the billions. The representative of the northwest corner of the state doesn't have a dog in the fight. And it's an issue that doesn't resonate with his constituents or her constituents, thus creating some political tensions. But to someone in downtown Minneapolis or St. Paul, it means a lot different. So how that political fight is fought and played out, and if it's done with respect, there's opportunities, I think, to bridge that gap. We also we just live in a political toxic world right now, and we all know that, right? So we don't treat each other like people, we treat each other like I'm right, you're wrong. And a lot of the rural-urban issues come down that line. I've been to meeting upon meeting with my friends in the metro area, and they do a lot of that us and them talk, but it's almost like, well, we know how to fix it out there for you. You want to make someone in rural Minnesota mad? Tell us you know how to fix our problems. No. We don't need someone from Minneapolis to tell us. But if you would have said that in a different way, we could have been at a table and having that conversation. So again, it's things that we learn in kindergarten, right? We just have to talk to each other like people and trust and respect and learn from each other. We have to stop treating people like I'm going to win and you're going to lose.
I think there have been some advancements in physiology. This is an analogy. When we go back and we look, we see that a lot of the drugs that women take today, a lot of the things that are administered to women were only tested on men for decades. And we've found this out now that, I don't want to break this news to everybody, but men and women are different. Their bodies respond differently to different drugs, different hormones, et cetera. And the idea of testing, for example, pregnancy-based hormones on men and then administering them on women is a ridiculous notion that we did for a long, long time, because all of our science was very male-based. And I think we've come to grasp how backward that is. To me, the last point you made is exactly that in a built environment sense. I love the Humphrey Institute. I love the fact that you're doing rural program. I had to build my own small town program in the larger program because everything was very urban focused, big city focused. And to pull out the bits that would actually be relevant to my place was really, really hard. Small towns are not smaller versions of big cities, and when we just apply them as if we're applying, male drugs to women, we miss something really big and really essential. And I think it's important that we, not just from an education standpoint, but just from a human standpoint, go back to, it's not in opposition to solidarity, but the subsidiarity concept that is embedded in Catholic teaching. A big part of that is not only do we give people the ability to make their own decisions, we actually insist on it. Because when we steal their agency from them, when we make their decision for them someplace else, or impose a set of decisions on them, we lessen them as humans. The idea of subsidiarity is the idea that we shouldn't be deciding light rail in the metro area with representatives from northeastern Minnesota. They don't have a dog in that fight. Well, why are they part of that conversation? But on the other hand, if we don't allow people in Crow Wing County, Minnesota, to figure out their own problems, if we impose a solution on them or come in outside, we're stealing from them not only their solution, but their capacity to find and discover and make that solution theirs. I'm not saying there shouldn't be solutions. We need to work on these problems, but we need to allow them to figure it out and fail and iterate and come up with it. That's a very Catholic approach.
That's great. Thank you, Chuck. One last question. We're running up on time here, but I did want to give Tim the opportunity and the challenge, perhaps, to give us 2 practical ways in which you're seeing people include those on the margins, the poor and the vulnerable, in decision-making and in fostering strong places where people thrive and communities flourish.
Thank you. So one thing is, again, our parish has a Spanish-speaking mission basically attached to it for all of Montgomery County. All the confessions are in Spanish, that sort of thing. Our pastor has reached out with an effort to bring as many of these families into the school as possible, as well as into the rest of parish life. And one of the funny things I didn't think about until I was writing this book was how sort of ultimately democratic even a Catholic parish is, that the things that get done are the things that the parishioners, the lay people, are willing to do. Father Dan can make stuff happen, and usually we do what he tells us to do because we trust him, but the shape of the parish is determined by the activism, the choices, the energy of the people in there. So the sort of multi-step plan is bring as many of these Spanish-speaking people into more of our daily life, and then make them be like the other families who are the ones starting the T-ball, starting the pro-life group, running the adoration, all these things that are lay initiated. That would be the way to empower them. And a lot of it is just, hey, is there something you want to do where the parish can provide resources? And that's what's so empowering. Again, I got to run baseball teams. It's like a dream come true. I never would have gotten to do that if not for a parish. So once you get these people roped in, you say, is there something you want to do? and you need our land, whatever money we can scrounge up, or just the newsletter to rope in people. That would be the number one way that I would see inclusion and empowerment happening.
The Catholic Church approaches issues with the two wings of faith and reason, and I think our panel did a great job exemplifying both of those wings today. So could we thank our panel and our speaker? Again, we're grateful to all of you for our attendance, for enriching our discussion with your presence and your questions this morning. Again, copies of Tim's book, hopefully some are still available, but we also have some resources in the back for you to pick up on your way out. Thank you again for coming, and now I'd like to invite Bishop Quinn from the Diocese of Winona-Rochester to come to the podium, please.
I think all of us have been enriched. This has been a great experience. In fact, I think from just judging at the tables, everybody had lots of comments and lots of thoughts that were coming. So thank you, Tim, and to our panel. Let's thank them again. They did an exceptional job. You know, I grew up on the east side of Detroit, so I grew up in a very ethnic neighborhood. But one of the things that I learned that's so important is the connectedness that we had. I was thinking, Tim, as you were speaking, my brother Georgie was older than I am, and the place that we all would hang out was called Stribal Drugs, and it was maybe 5 blocks away. Well, my brother Georgie had smoked his first cigarette outside Stribal Drugs at age 16. Before my brother could get home, the phone had rung 5 times. And it was not saying what a great guy he is. It was to alert my mom and dad, did you know your son is smoking? Well, what I thought about that connectedness, the accountability, the fact that we do care for each other in our neighborhoods, we kind of lost that. In fact, we're kind of afraid to speak up. I think often with the way in which our virtuous training, the various ways in which we work on a safe environment, if you see something, say something. And I think we got to capture some of that again in our relatedness. Something else that really struck me was how we need to include the poor. And one of the ways that I know I have been taught by the poor is they have names. You don't just do things to the poor. I remember many years ago, I was working for the Archdiocese of Detroit, and I would come down every morning right after Mass, or sometimes teaching a class at the seminary, and there would be probably 50 people at a warming center. Well, I learned to start calling them by name. In fact, there was one who wanted my attention and would ask me if we could go for coffee. Now, you know, I was busy. I had a lot of things to do, and so I would try and avoid him. In fact, one time I went around the other side of the parking garage, and then he found me. And he said to me, come on, Father, how about today? And I would come up with an excuse every time. And he'd always say to me, we'll catch you next time. Well, finally, he did. And he said to me, come on, Father, let's do it this morning. Well, I said, there's no place here to sit down and even to have a cup of coffee. I said, Tom, you know, there isn't any place. We'll do it another time. Now, if you've worked with people who are in transition, they teach you a lot. First of all, I learned his name, but he said to me, Father, I brought the coffee. And he reaches in and pulls out a thermos bottle. And then he pulls out a sugar and creamer packet. Now, you know that people who are homeless, they have to save up those things. And he even sat down with me on a park bench and said, would you like a stirrer? Now, the real reason he wanted to talk to me was not because of my ability to give him any real answers, but he said to me, would you pray for me? He said, my life has been really broken. My family has kind of separated from me because of my drinking and because of my drugs. And I've caused so many problems. But he said, Father, my daughter invited me for Mother's Day, and I really have tried to be clean. Would you pray for me so that I won't mess this up? Well, see, that's why we connect with the poor. We need them. We need them to show us the way to the kingdom of God. So including them means connectedness. They're not a problem. They're brothers and sisters. But also they have names, and like all of us, they got a story to tell. And the last thing I learned today, we have to give people hope that there is a future. And that future for us who are believers is rooted in the promise of Jesus Christ. And so the more that we believe in that future, we really connect with people in the here and now. Because by showing our connectedness, by our love for others, by taking their problems seriously, we're really revealing to them the fact of God's love. God is a communion, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Our God is not some isolated monad. He's a communion of love. So much so that communion of love chose to bring about creation, to bring human life, to grace it, to redeem it, and to say to us, one day we'll share in that communion in heaven with the triune God and all the blessed. Mother Teresa always said, be good to the poor, because they may be the ones that plead for you at the end of your life before the Lord and say, let him in, let her in. I always love that prayer in our nuptial blessing where we say to the couple, be good to the poor because they in turn will find in you generous friends and one day welcome you to the kingdom of God. So I hope you've enjoyed this morning. I've sure learned a lot. Let's thank our Tom and also everyone else for their Tim and also all the panelists. Let's thank them again. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Gracious Father, we thank you for the gift that you give us, the sending of your Son, Jesus Christ, and the outpouring of the Holy Spirit. For you have given us, Lord, a destiny and a purpose, but most of all, you've connected us not only with you through the power of grace, but a connectedness in that grace to one another. As we have learned today, how important it is we not be anonymous or isolated. Help us to welcome others into that communio. And as we share our lives in so many communities, may it open our hearts so that we see your gracious hand at work and see the blessedness in all human beings. May we respect their dignity and honor them, and especially those who are poor, and as our Holy Father reminds us, those on the periphery. Keep us hope-filled, for our true home one day will be with you. But in this world, help us to transform this world more by your justice, by your mercy and your compassion. We ask all of this through Christ our Lord. Amen. May the blessing of Almighty God, the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit come upon us and remain forever and ever. Amen.